Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you can see the PowerPoint slides on the screen. I can, so I'm hoping everybody else can too, and that you can hear me loud and clear. In relation to any questions, we'd like to assure you that no question is a silly question. And if you're not sure about something, there's a strong possibility that others may not be sure either. So I would like to encourage questions from everyone. Please ask your questions via the question box, the chat box today on your control panel. For any questions that are not answered during the session, we'll ensure that we take them away and find an answer for everyone after the session. Please begin by thinking about what questions you'd like to be answered today, what you'd like to get out of today's session on domestic abuse in education and childcare. Please interact with us throughout the session and ask any questions as we go along. As with any training session, you will get out what you put in, so please stay engaged and share best practice. Please also be mindful that this is an incredibly sensitive subject and the content of this session might be upsetting, so take breaks if you need them. And if anybody is affected by any of the content in today's session, there are signposting details throughout the webinar. You can also visit nspcc.org.uk for more information and support. We'll just do a few welcome and introductions. I'm Stacey Mann. I'm the subject specialist for early years and childcare here at NCFE, working on all of the cash qualifications, mainly in the early years space. I'm joined today by Kelly Johnson, who's one of our provider development officers, and we have our email addresses on the screen for you. Please do take a note of them for any questions that you may have after today, and also if you've got any suggestions for further sessions in the future. We're also joined today by Kerry Leask. Kerry, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi everyone. I work for Northumbria's Violence Reduction Unit, delivering sort of education packages and support to staff, pupils and families across the Northumbria Force area.
Fantastic, thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us today and bringing so much value to today's session. You can really bring this to life for us. There we go. Our intentions for today are to provide an introduction and overview of domestic abuse in educational and childcare settings. We will explore the types and signs of domestic abuse and how this can affect the children and young people in our care. We'll also look at ways to support you in the workplace, including some interventions that could be implemented. And throughout, we really encourage you to reflect on your practice and your current practice, ensuring that all policies and procedures are up to date and relevant. What lots of people do when they come to these training sessions is to go back and disseminate the training to the rest of the staff team to make sure that you're all singing from the same song sheet and that you are sharing best practice from our reflections today. Whoops. I apologise for that. So to ensure that you have travelled a journey with us today, we really like you to rate your confidence at the start of the session. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you with knowledge of domestic abuse in education and childcare? And that's 10 being extremely confident and 1 being not so confident. We will review the impact of the session content by doing another poll at the end of the webinar to ensure that you've travelled a journey with us today. We can all go on training sessions, but it's really what we take away from these sessions that impact on our practice. Okay, so I think everybody has voted. So quite low today in confidence, sort of everybody be between 3, 4, and not really much higher than that. So that's absolutely fine. So hopefully you'll be able to pick up a few golden nuggets today that you can take back to support your practice. Okay, so you might want to make a note of that yourself as well. Dealing with domestic abuse in an educational setting can be tricky, mainly due to the actual abuse taking place within another house and not directly to the child or young person. The physical signs that you may see with other types of abuse won't necessarily be seen by you, and so the behavioural and emotional signs are what you're really going to be looking out for. There will be scenarios shared today that are real, and names will have been changed to protect confidentiality. However, they are real. So these scenarios are unfortunately very common. Children can experience both short and long-term cognitive, behavioural and emotional effects as a result of experiencing domestic abuse. I hope everybody can hear me okay. My audio keeps giving me a message to say that it's not working properly. So I hope you can still hear me. Each child will respond to the trauma differently, and some may be resilient and not exhibit any negative effects at all, which obviously makes it a lot more difficult to recognise. It's equally important to remember that these responses may also be caused by something other than experiencing domestic abuse, and we'll keep that in mind as we go along today. We will be looking at some statistics, but it would be a disservice for us not to mention the impact of the recent, of the pandemic, not the recent really, and the rises in cases. Okay, so to put some of this in perspective for you, the first scenario that we'll be sharing is to get you to think about different situations. So a child in the setting has started to show aggression towards other children. He's age 3 and was overheard saying, "If you don't give me that toy, you're going to get it." The key person and designated safeguarding lead, the DSL, discussed that they never see mum in the setting and that she works from home. They arrange a meeting with both mom and dad, but dad makes an excuse for mom coming in. When the setting call home to confirm the meeting, mom says that she didn't know anything about it. Dad attends the meeting and seems to be acting strangely. So what do you think could be happening? So you can use your chat box to discuss that with me. What do you think could be happening? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the responses coming in. Controlling behaviour at a minimum is one of the suggestions there. Okay. And what do you think you could do next? Or what would you do next? Just think about how you would deal with this particular scenario. And what are the first things that come to mind? The follow-up of this scenario is that dad admits that mom is hitting him at home, and he was ashamed to admit that a woman was beating him. He had decided not to tell her about the meeting and what was going on in the setting because he was worried that she would take it out on him. This is an ideal scenario to share with students to ensure that they try to build the whole picture and not to jump to conclusions. Not everything is as it seems. The Office for National Statistics figures shows every year that 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse are male, equating to 757,000 men, and 1 in 6 to 7 men and 1 in 4 women will be a victim of domestic abuse in their lifetime. Of domestic abuse crimes recorded by the police, 26% were committed against men, and that equates to 155,000 offences per year. So not everything is as it seems, and this highlights how few men are being supported for local domestic abuse services, but also these statistics are not always reflective due to men not coming forward, just like in this scenario. Kerry, I don't know whether you want to come in there and just share anything to do with males and domestic violence.
Yeah, there's usually a bit of a stigma attached, and I think that's why a lot of men don't speak up, because they think that, you know, it's 2 seconds. I'm just gonna ask my son to take the dog out of the room because he's I've got a puppy and he's a little bit excited. Out, please.
That's absolutely fine.
He's 8 months and my son's just come in from college, so he's a little bit lively. So he's gone out. Apologies for that. Yeah, I think with men, like obviously they think that it's something they should either deal with themselves, or that people won't believe them, or that it's, you know, it's not something that a man should be suffering, I guess. It is getting better. We are seeing more males come forward. It does tend to be more about like the coercive control, or the emotional and manipulative kind of abuse, rather than physical. But physical still happens, and what tends to happen is it'll start off as a one-off incident, and then because, you know, that doesn't get reported, then it will repeat. And it quite often goes hand in hand with substance abuse, we find as well. So you usually find that's going on with the perpetrator as well, and that's sometimes what kind of fuels that kind of incident. And we're seeing it more and more in young boys as well. During my sessions, I see a lot of sort of teenage boys admitting that their girlfriends force them to give them their password so they can check their phones and check their social media accounts and things like that. And it's really normalized, which is really worrying, because they go, well, you know, well, why not? Why would I not let that happen? So I think it's quite a challenge to, you know, educate about that and say, you know, that that's not normal, that you shouldn't have to do that. That's not a normal trusting relationship, but it's something we're seeing more and more, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. And I think for those of us working with young people, that's really important for us to know, because I think if you've got an awareness of that, then it automatically changes your empathy, your approaches towards that person, and towards all the students. So I think it's really good that we know those sorts of things are going on, because then we can do something about it. Because I think often the advice about relationships, about consent, about putting boundaries in place and what a healthy relationship looks like, are often aimed towards females. So making sure that's aimed towards everyone is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously it does happen with females as well, but it's definitely the whole, you know, making somebody look, you know, like show them their phone and share the passwords, definitely seems to be more prevalent with girls making boys do that.
Yeah.
So in my colleagues' experience, and like I say, and usually they're really surprised when you tell them that that isn't, you know, a sign of a healthy relationship. That's something that, you know, they shouldn't be allowing. It's genuine shock or surprise that that's, you know, that's a sign of abuse. They really have no idea about that. So I think probably, you know, the earlier you can educate young people that, you know, that's not okay, and you shouldn't have to do that, then that all the better, definitely.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of the students that we're working with will be going into careers in early years, childcare, teaching assistant, those sorts of roles, working in schools, working in education. And we're in a perfect position to relay those messages, aren't we? And make sure that those messages are loud and clear. Okay, so moving on slightly, children never just witness domestic abuse. The law now recognises that they can be victims. Exposure to domestic abuse is child abuse, and it can have a significant impact on child's development, health and well-being, which is why our observations are so important. Around 1 in 5 children have been exposed to domestic abuse, according to the NSPCC evidence in 2011, and I'm sure that has increased, and I'm sure Kerry will talk to us about that a little bit later on as well. Police in England and Wales have made an average of 669 child protection referrals a day to social services in the last year. During the pandemic, the NSPCC helpline responded to over 11,600 contacts about domestic abuse in 2021, a 35% increase on the previous year. For some children and families, home might not be a safe place, and staying there will be extremely challenging. Some may already be experiencing domestic abuse or worried an adult's behaviour is changing and escalating. And if you and your family are in immediate danger, call 999. If you're unable to talk, press 55 after dialing. And I think that's something that we really everybody should know. It's okay to leave your home during lockdown if your lockdown was obviously something that we were discussing last time. If you're experiencing abuse, the police can also remove the person harming you from your home. So what is domestic abuse? Domestic abuse is any type of controlling, bullying, threatening or violent behaviour between people in a relationship. It could also involve being coercive and manipulative or gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that makes you question your beliefs and perception of reality. Over time, this type of manipulation can wear down your self-esteem and self-confidence, leaving you dependent on the person gaslighting you. It can seriously harm children and young people, and experiencing domestic abuse is child abuse, as we said earlier on. It's important to remember domestic abuse can happen inside and outside of the home. It can happen over the phone, on the internet, and on social networking sites. It can happen in any relationship and can continue even after the relationship has ended. Both men and women can be abused or abusers. Now let's take a look at the types of abuse in context of domestic abuse. Domestic violence, as we've seen, involves a variety of components. In abusive relationships, as with children, child abuse and safeguarding, it's frequently the case that no single type of abuse is present to the exclusion of all the others. Likewise, the material provided here is intended to serve as a guide only and is not exhaustive. As with other parts of child safety, if anything doesn't seem right, ask yourself why and analyse what you're seeing and hearing, making sure to incorporate the victim's lived experience in determining put my teeth back in, which category the abuse falls into. Domestic abuse can be emotional, physical, sexual, financial, or psychological, such as physical violence, including kicking, hitting, punching, or cutting, which they may try to minimize or trivialize. Rape, including in a relationship. Gaslighting, withholding food, drink, medicines. Controlling someone's finances by withholding money or not allowing them to go to work. Controlling behaviour, like telling someone where they can go and what they can wear, just as we were talking earlier on. Not letting someone leave the house or isolating them from friends and family. Checking or monitoring emails, text messages or letters. They may also be forced to give their passwords over, just as Kerry was telling us. Threatening to kill someone or harm themselves. Making threats or threatening behaviour towards another family member or a pet. Actual harm on a family member or pet. Now, that is a lot to be looking at there and a lot to unpick, but definitely something that you can go back to and look at with your staff teams and with colleagues and with students as well. The source for all of this is from the NSPCC website.
Can I just say as well, it's worth noting that these relationships aren't always, between a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. It can be obviously same-sex relationships. It can be family as well. So it could be that, a brother's abusing a sister, or any kind of close relationship can be a domestic abuse relationship. It could be that somebody is withholding money from their grandparent or something like that and abusing them in that way, and the police would still treat it in the same way. It might just look slightly different, the type of abuse, but it isn't sort of just between that intimate relationship. It can be in other forms as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important to add, because I think you do go straight to that intimate relationship, don't you, and not think about the wider relationships that we have. The effects of domestic abuse. Living in a home where domestic abuse happens can have a serious impact on a child or young person's mental and physical well-being, as well as their behaviour, and that can last up into adulthood. What's important is to make sure the abuse stops and that the children have a safe and stable environment to grow up in. I think we're really looking at this in multiple layers, because if we're delivering the qualifications, we are responsible for the learners, the students in front of us, but also if they're going on to work in education and childcare, we're also thinking about the safeguarding that we teach to them. So we're also thinking about those under fives in these situations as well, and the families that we're working with. Our services can support children and young people who have experienced domestic abuse to help them move on and receive the care they need. And again, that comes from NSPCC because they have so many resources available on their website, but there also are local support systems available. And Kerry will be talking to us a little bit later on when we look at the signposting for that. As with any situation involving child protection or safeguarding, we must first get to know the children with whom we deal, and any changes in their behaviour that are out of the ordinary should always be recorded and reported. Other pieces of information may be accessible, as with other forms of abuse, to help develop a fuller picture of what is going on for the child or young person, just like we saw in that first scenario. And as you will see, many of the signs and symptoms on the screen in front of you could also be indications and symptoms of other types of abuse as well. It can be difficult to tell if domestic abuse is happening, and those carrying out the abuse can act very differently when other people are around. Children and young people might also feel frightened and confused, keeping the abuse to themselves, because often there's a lot of blame. They blame themselves, and there's the shame as well that's attached to that. So some of the signs that a child has witnessed domestic abuse can include aggression or bullying, antisocial behaviour like vandalism, anxiety, depression or suicidal thoughts, attention seeking, being very needy or over familiar. I always think that if we're talking attention seeking, I think we always need to replace that word attention with attachment. I don't think any children are attention seeking. They're always seeking attachment and always seeking someone to support them. And I think as soon as we swap that word, we see the behaviour in a different way. Bedwetting and nightmares or insomnia, regression in general, constant or regular sickness like colds, headaches, and mouth ulcers. That's comes a lot of the time from stress. Drug or alcohol use, eating disorders, problems in school or trouble learning, tantrums or meltdowns, often for very trivial reasons, withdrawal or changes in behaviour. And again, it's about knowing the children, knowing the young people that you work with, and really building a relationship with them to recognise any of these signs, but also recognise any changes in behaviour as well. The effects of living in a home where there is domestic abuse can be wide-ranging. Children can suffer multiple physical and mental health consequences as a result of exposure to domestic abuse. Abusive behaviour amongst affected children was most common amongst the 15 to 17-year-olds, with the behaviours most frequently directed towards the child's mother, sibling or friend, and rarely towards the main perpetrator of the domestic abuse. It's worth noting that child-to-parent violence is often a result from their experience, and most children who have experienced domestic abuse substantially will grow up to become either a victim or perpetrator themselves without the correct intervention. Research suggests that children will continue to display abusive behaviour after the abuse in the home has ended. This can be due to the emotional impact of the abuse, but may also be related to learnt behaviour of how to react in certain situations. And this is a perfect time to talk about our case study. And this is actually a little boy that I was involved with supporting. So little Joe attends a large nursery for children aged birth to 5 years. He's 3 years old and is currently in the preschool room with another 25 children. His key person is a calm, quiet person, and she understands how to support little Joe when he's having a day where he's not feeling happy. She has implemented strategies to calm him when self-regulation is not an option. His behaviour is described as erratic, aggressive, and sporadic. He bites, hits, smacks, and throws toys when it appears that nothing has triggered him to. During the observation, the key person was sent on her lunch break and replaced by a loud, bubbly leader. She commanded the room, and all the children were loving her vibrancy, except for little Joe. His body visibly tensed. He stayed on the outskirts of the room and he began to lose control. He pushed, hit, threw toys, and screamed, covering his ears. You see, little Joe had experienced domestic violence to an alarming degree in his 3 years of life. A loud voice to him equated to danger, blood, screaming, and turmoil. It didn't matter to him that the loud voice was bubbly, happy, or non-threatening. It was loud, and that was enough to set his brain into fight, flight, or freeze. An observation tool that's often used by teachers is something called the ABC approach. And the ABC approach looks at what happened before the behaviour, the antecedent, the actual behaviour, and then the consequence. So that's your ABC, the antecedent, what happened before, the behaviour, what they did, and the consequence. Lots and lots of people still use the ABC approach in education. However, for little Joe and for lots and lots of children, cortisol, which is our stress chemical, will build up in the brain throughout the day and send children into fight, flight, or freeze. So that's when they might throw something, or they may not be in charge, in control of their impulses because of the cortisol that's in their brain. Within those sorts of scenarios, you also have part of your brain that will remember, so it will have triggers. So as we said during this scenario, this lovely manager who would come into the setting she was great. She'd come in and go, hello, but that loud voice for him meant something very, very different. And in his brain, he would go straight to, wow, there's been a loud voice, something bad's now going to happen. And they hadn't recognised that. So all they kept seeing was the behaviour. And then they would look at the antecedent and do this ABC approach and think, well, there's no trigger. There was no trigger to that because they weren't self-reflecting as well. And also because they didn't understand brain development. And so early intervention is always key, and support can be given within our remits. And where it's not in our remit, we can signpost. Firstly, it's important to keep learning. Knowledge will give you confidence in what you're trying to support in the first place. Within knowledge and confidence, there's a strong understanding of brain development and neuroscience will support when understanding your triggers. So this is linked to the brain, the elephant brain analogy. So your elephant brain, the part of the brain that's called the hippocampus, is where we store memories, very, very simply put. So the elephant never forgets is the analogy. The other two parts of the brain that we'll think about is the amygdala, which is your meerkat brain. It's where you go into your fight, flight, or freeze, your survival brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which is your owl. So your meerkat is your reactions, your impulses, and your owl is where learning is made permanent. So imagine a meerkat pushing the owl off the branch once in charge. So once those triggers have come into place, so that, again, thinking of little Joe, it's then difficult to be able to self-regulate and communicate, because what the meerkat will do, what that part of your brain will do, is stop your owl from thinking correctly. I'm sure we've all been in that position before where we've gone into fight, flight, or freeze. So continue to think about how you can increase your knowledge in brain development and neuroscience to support the children in your care. Because once you do that, you can support to co-regulate and get them to a calm space so that you can start supporting their development. It's also important to continue to share and discuss the knowledge to support each other. An increasing number of studies around the world have identified that certain adverse experiences during childhood can have long-term negative impacts on our health and well-being. The term adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are used to describe these and includes experiences that directly hurt a child or affect them through the environment in which they live. This includes growing up in a household where domestic violence, parental separation, mental illness, alcohol abuse, or drug abuse is present, or where someone has been incarcerated. Domestic abuse, Recovering Together, DART, is to help children cope with the effects of domestic abuse, and the programme allows children and mothers to talk openly. It says mothers in their programme, but I'm sure you'll find other sources that will support on the NSPCC website as well. Another useful resource in early years settings is a storybook called Little Meerkat's Big Panic by Jane Evans. And it talks about once upon a time there was a little meerkat with a very important job to do. Today was the day when Little Meerkat finally took a turn at being the lookout meerkat, watching for dangers to protect the meerkat gang. It was all going well until Little Meerkat fell asleep and woke up to find everyone had disappeared. That sent Little Meerkat into one very big panic. And then it talks about the help from the elephant and they call it the monkey in the Little Meerkat's Big Panic. And it looks at easy ways for 2 to 6 year olds to calm their body and brain when they're feeling anxious. And it also includes really great guidance around neuroscience and the strategies and how you can use that book as an educator to help children. It's important to trust your gut and your gut instinct. If a child reveals or talks to you about domestic abuse, it's important to listen carefully to what they're saying. Let them know that they've done the right thing by telling you. Tell them it's not their fault and say you'll take them seriously. Don't confront the alleged abuser because you yourself might feel quite angry, but you need to keep quite neutral in the situation and explain what you'll do next and report what the child has told you as soon as possible. So in my experience, I had an 8-year-old boy, which was not my age group, but I was working as a relaxed kids coach doing mindfulness sessions with lots of primary schools. And during a session with an 8-year-old, it was a one-to-one session, and we were doing a very simple activity of writing down worries and ripping them up. And one of the things that he wrote down was that he was really scared that his dad was going to hurt his mom again, and that's all he'd written. And then on a different post-it note, he'd talked about a knife. During that conversation, I followed everything that I'd learned in the past from just being really calm and just telling him he'd done the right thing. The difficult part of a disclosure for me was when he started crying and telling me that he didn't want me to tell anybody else. And I had to tell somebody else. So, and I was really clear with him and honest with him that that's what I needed to do. It was a very difficult situation, but it was a very serious one. And when that was communicated to the head teacher, it was dealt with immediately. So much so that a statement was taken from him from social services by the end of that day. And I got to see him the following week, expecting him to hate me for sharing that information. It was quite the opposite. He walked into the room and his whole demeanour had changed. His shoulders had relaxed. He looked like he'd had a weight lifted off of him. And he came straight over and hugged me and thanked me for sharing that information. So as difficult as it is, as difficult as it was to be in that situation, often you're the person that these children and young people can confide in. So I'm sure you've seen this disclosures information lots and lots of times before, but at some point you might have to use that. Kerry, I don't know whether you want to come in at that point after anything that I've said there.
Yeah, I agree. It is really hard with disclosures. Even if you've said at some point in the session, you know, that everything here is confidential. However, if you tell me something that, you know, makes me worry about you, then I will have to tell somebody else. It doesn't matter. They'll still, usually with most disclosures, they'll have that moment of panic where, you know, they regret saying something because they're frightened of the outcome and, you know, worried that it'll make things worse for that parent or themselves or both. And it is really hard, but obviously you have to do something and you have to tell exactly what they've said to whoever's the safeguarding lead. But thankfully, most of the time, if you speak to that child later, you know, when things have been dealt with and there's help involved and, you know, mum or dad, whoever's affected is getting that support, they'll usually say then that they were glad that they said it, they were just scared at the time. It's very rare that you'll get, you know, something where nothing good comes of that. There usually is some kind of support mechanism put in place. Even if that parent doesn't want the help, there's usually some kind of support that the child can get, regardless whether it be counselling within school or a nurture group or something like that. There's usually something good comes of that. So even though it can be quite stressful for you as the person that they've disclosed that to, you know, it is helpful and it is going to do something positive for that situation.
That's good to hear, and I think it reassures all the listeners as well that, you know, this is so important. We know it's important, but in that moment, it really is important to what happens going forward. Okay, so we're just going to move on to what to do next. So for any referrals, follow your own policies and procedures and make sure they're in line with your local authority. Do check them, reflect on what we've said today, and have a look at what they're saying right now and how they can be improved. Regularly visit your local authority safeguarding partnership website, keeping up to date with your own community and what is happening. And also, as we said, it's a twofold approach today, signposting you and signposting the students when they're working with the children. But it's also when you are signposting anybody that's involved in domestic abuse, you're also thinking parents and carers and also the child in these situations that we're discussing today. As outlined in part 1 of Keeping Children Safe in Education, when a concern is identified, there are 3 possible outcomes. Number 1, managing any support for the child internally through the school or college's own pastoral support processes. Number 2, an early help assessment. Number 3, a referral for statutory services, such as if the child is in need, or is suffering or is likely to suffer harm. It's critical that we recall the bullet points given above if any adult or colleague speaks to you about their experiences. It's not our place to pass judgment, make excuses for the victim or the perpetrator, or insist that the connection be ended. We know from victim study that it's first and foremost about communicating, and then they might contemplate doing something about it afterwards. They're not expecting you to solve their problem or know all of the answers. It's equally critical that we recognise that colleagues with whom we interact on a daily basis or on a less frequent basis may also be victims of domestic abuse. We should also be aware that they may require assistance and that due to our intimate working ties, we may notice changes in them and their behaviour. If someone is worried about their partner, then they can make a request under Clare's law. Active from 8th of March 2014, the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme was implemented across England and Wales. It's often called Clare's Law after the landmark case that led to it. This isn't for reporting domestic abuse. This scheme gives any member of the public the right to ask the police if their partner, new or existing, may pose a risk to them. This scheme also allows a member of the public to make an inquiry into the partner of a close friend or family member. It's the right to ask. If records show that an individual may be at risk of domestic violence from a partner, the police will consider disclosing the information. The disclosure can be made if it is legal, proportionate and necessary to do so. Other interventions include Fearless, part of Crime Stoppers, an SPCC, tools and resources to raise awareness, and a safe space to talk, which shouldn't be underestimated. That safe space to talk is really crucial. There's some other signposting numbers and email addresses on this slide for you. And at the start, I did mention that the PDF to these slides is in the handout section for you to download.
Can I just sort of say as well, with Fearless being part of Crime Stoppers, I'm sure everyone's heard of Crime Stoppers, but it's an anonymous way of reporting any crime or any concern. So if somebody didn't feel confident to talk to the police, or they didn't want anyone to know that it was them reporting it, so say, you know, it could be that you hear your neighbour and you're worried that they are getting abused in some way, you could report it through Fearless. They use VPNs that scramble your data, so they have no idea who you are, where you are, they don't know your IP address. If you use the phone system, it scrambles your number and your whereabouts, so you can literally tell them whatever you need to tell them without any ties to that information. And it goes off your search history, it disappears after so many minutes, so nobody has to know unless you tell them. So it's a really safe way of reporting any kind of crime or any kind of concern without thinking, oh well, this might come back, because you can use it in your workplace as well. So if like a concern wasn't taken seriously, which unfortunately has happened when I've worked in a school, you know, they kind of said, well, no, we know that family, it'll be fine. And had I not worked for the police, I probably would have used that mechanism myself to report that concern, but I escalated that myself. But it is a really good method, and it'll always be anonymous because it's the whole basis of the charity.
Thank you, Kerry. That's really, really helpful. And also to reiterate what you said about following you know, we mentioned earlier about following your gut instincts, didn't we? And you do often get that response, don't you? Well, we know that family, oh, no, that wouldn't be right. And you never really know what is going on behind closed doors. And what we said right at the beginning, just drawing back upon that, was that you know, it's often covered up quite well, isn't it, in front of other people?
Yeah, it is, and you know, quite often it's the people that you least expect to be victims or perpetrators, and it's quite a shock sometimes when a child will disclose something, and you usually think, well, wow, that is the last parent or whatever that I thought would be involved in that kind of relationship. You know, because especially if it's emotional or mental abuse, and it's not physical, there's been no signs or indicators with the parents, because you just see them, you know, at the start of a school day, at the end of the school day, and it's completely different to what, like you say, is going on behind closed doors. So if, you know, something niggles at you, don't ignore that niggle, because generally your gut feeling is correct that there's something not right. And sometimes it's worth just looking into something, even if you're wrong. because it could be, you know, a massive difference for that child and maybe the affected parent involved as well.
Absolutely. You'd rather be wrong than it go, you know, escalate. Okay, some key reflections here for you. We wouldn't ask you to answer all of these today, but really take some moments after today's session to just think about what you're going to do with this training, with this knowledge and understanding, and what impact that will have on you and your role, and how that will benefit and impact your learners as well. And just acknowledge and discuss some of these things with the rest of your colleagues. Thanks everyone for sharing your ideas throughout. There are some links here to provide more information. The need for education and training across sectors to enable identification of abuse, allocation of support and referral is a recurring theme within regional domestic abuse strategies. And we also have some other bite sizes coming up that will again reiterate some of these messages. Our intentions today were to provide an introduction and overview of domestic abuse in education and childcare settings, to look at the types and signs of domestic abuse, and then to look at some interventions and discuss our reflections and practice. We have more bite-sized CPD webinars that are available on the CPD carousel for the Education and Childcare Careers Toolkit, and also on the YouTube channel. So we've got the safeguarding update briefing, we've got equality, diversity and inclusion, child protection and e-safety, peer-on-peer abuse, child abuse linked to faith and belief, wider forms of abuse, and coming up, county lines as well. You can find those on the VCERT playlist and the Education and Childcare Careers Toolkit. So we're going to revisit our poll at the end of today's session. So thinking about where you were at the start of today's session and where you are now. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being extremely confident and 1 being not so confident, we hope that you have improved your confidence levels today. And we hope that by the end of this webinar, you're now feeling a bit more knowledgeable and self-assured or refreshed. Oh, wow. So everybody has gone up. So we all started around 3 or 4 and we've gone up to 7 or 8, which is fantastic news for us. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank Kerry for attending today and supporting this webinar. It's always lovely to hear from you, Kerry, and for you to give us your knowledge. It's been great to have you today. Are there any questions? If there are, please pop them in the box. Alternatively, you can send us an email and we can answer those for you. We have got our, we haven't got our emails, but we've our emails are very, very easy, NCFE. So it's Stacey Mann without an E at ncfe.org.uk or Kelly Johnson at ncfe.org.uk. If there are no further questions, please feel free to leave the webinar. And when you do leave the webinar, we'd appreciate it if you could complete the short evaluation to help us make any future improvements and to change the services and the support we provide. Thanks again, everyone. And on behalf of everyone here at NCFE, we wish you a safe and a successful year.